Alright, welcome back. This is part 3 of our lecture about why we should care about global warming. In the last part, we were talking about the physical impacts, temperature changes, precipitation changes, ocean acidification, and so on. Let's talk about some of the impacts on people and the environment. Let's just talk about people. People as in, like, literally as in how it affects us and how we thrive and so on. And we mentioned before, heat waves are the single largest source of weather-related deaths in the United States. And as a consequence, it is true that we're also expecting the number of cold waves to decrease. We're not expecting quite as many, extremely low temperatures as in the past, but that doesn't offset the relatively, by increasing the number of heat waves that will be happening in the United States, we will be expecting more fatalities and so on. There's very direct effects on the things we eat, like crops and so on, too. The process of photosynthesis is actually very dependent on temperatures. Individual species of plants have a fixed range of temperatures over which they conduct their photosynthesis most efficiently, and where if the temperature gets outside of that range, the plant won't be producing food very efficiently. And so if you start having more and more days in which, for at least part of the day, the plant is not efficiently producing food, you are reducing the yields of these crops. And as your textbook says, even under the most favorable emission scenario, yields of our most important crops are expected to decline by roughly 33% until the end of the century. Whereas under the most pessimistic scenarios like A1FI, the one where we're burning so much fossil fuels, yields are expected to decline by 80%. I'm sorry, 70%. That should be very alarming to you. Okay? Now, of course, humans are clever. We're going to find ways to adapt. We'll probably raise different foods and so on, or find different varieties of the foods to grow and so on. But the basic idea that's a major problem. It's a transition. We have to invest in infrastructure. We have to learn how to fertilize these plants. We have to learn how to care for pests in these plants and so on. That's a major issue. You know what's another really scary thing about global warming? It has impacts on national security. There's a lot of concern that global warming will lead to destabilization to a lot of vulnerable parts in the world. There will be disruptions in their economic activity, or their ability to produce food, or their ability to have fresh water. There can be climate refugees and migration patterns as people leave areas that are no longer, where they can no longer raise crops, or where they no longer have access to fresh water, or where there's a conflict over access to water in a dam or something like that. All of which can lead to things like societal disruptions and failed states and wars, all of which we get dragged into even if it isn't happening on our doorstep, okay? That is very alarming. And that is why, I don't want to be overly pointing to one political party or another, but in the second Obama administration, there were a lot of headlines about things like, Obama was working to see, to have climate change considered a national security risk, and a lot of the other presidential candidates and so on considered that kind of laughable. But in fact, it's a very keen analysis of the situation. There are national security implications if we don't address climate change. Another human impact of climate change is disease. A lot of diseases spread in ways that are related to the climate in which we live. Many diseases are spread by what are called vectors. The vector is what moves the pathogen. The pathogen is like the germ, the bacterium, the fungus, the amoeba, the virus, whatever. A vector is what moves that pathogen from one person to another, or through one part of its life cycle to another. Well, many unfortunate diseases, especially tropical diseases, are spread by mosquitoes. They're the vector that transmits the disease. And the population and the range of both the vector and the pathogen itself can change as a result of temperature changes. A few years ago, I was actually involved in a research project that was about the spread of malaria in the future. And it turned out to be really very complicated because climate change will change the habitat of the mosquitoes, but the pathogen itself that is the malaria disease also is very much influenced by temperature and so on. It was actually not terribly straightforward as to where there would be more and where there would be less malaria in the future. But there's no doubt about it, it will change. Change in ways that are hard to predict, absolutely. But for example, we know that cold nights wipe out a lot of the mosquito population. So the more cold nights you have, the more times, let's say half the mosquitoes die on a very cold night. then, have a couple cold nights in a row and you might only have an eighth of the mosquitoes still surviving. Well, to have fewer cold nights, you just have more mosquitoes. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean more disease. It doesn't necessarily mean that more mosquitoes are carrying the pathogen. It's all very complicated. But there's a whole lot of really scary diseases that do spread by mosquitoes, like dengue fever, West Nile, Zika virus, malaria, elephantiasis, yellow fever, chikungunya, and many more. All of which will spread in new and complicated ways. That's not theory. We already have problems with how tropical diseases spread and due to changes in the distribution of mosquitoes and so on, just due to year-to-year variability of the climate. Events like El Nino, where there are changes in the temperature of various parts of the world for a year or so, result in changes in the distribution of these tropical diseases now. That is only going to get more complicated in the future. There's also the whole story, by the way, of refugees. Refugees are a big part of the story of the spread of tropical diseases too, because refugee camps are terrible for disease. They're complicated, let's put it that way. They're complicated with regard to disease because it's a large number of people living in a small area, often with relatively poor hygiene situations and so on. On the other hand, there's also typically relief agencies on site doing things like vaccinations. So it's complicated, but if we're going to live in a world where there's more climate refugees and more conflict and so on associated with global warming, we're also going to need to worry about more spread of diseases associated with refugee camps. How about the effects on drinking water? I mean, this is the kind of thing that you often see when, there's a story on the news about climate change or something like that. They're going to be talking about, access to drinking water in sub-Saharan Africa or something like that. And the answer is that's a complicated question. I mean, there's going to be very different answers as to the availability of drinking water depending on different regions. Some places are going to get more water, some places are going to get less water in the form of rainfall. Some places are able to retain more of that water because they have more infrastructure as far as things like reservoirs and so on, or cisterns and other ways of storing the water for when they need it later. Some places, more rainfall doesn't necessarily mean more availability of drinking water because they don't have the right water purification plants and so on. The effects are going to be extremely regional, and the timing of the availability of the fresh water is very hard to predict this far in advance. If they get more rainfall, but it's during the wet season where already almost all the rainfall is running off of the saturated soils and running into the ocean, that doesn't actually increase the availability of drinking water, in contrast to more rainfall in the dry season where the rainfall can accumulate in reservoirs and in groundwater moisture and so on. Makes a very big difference. No matter what, planning is going to be the story of water management. We're going to need to be able to make good plans for different parts of the world about how to manage their fresh water. While we're on the subject of fresh water, how about irrigation? So much of the agriculture in the world depends on our ability to irrigate crops that would otherwise not be able to grow in a given region. Demand for irrigation is going to change. That's scary. Partially by changing the temperatures and changing what crops grow, partially by changing the distribution of precipitation, we're going to be changing where we need irrigation. And irrigation requires a lot of infrastructure, both in terms of pipes and pumps and things like that, and also just in terms of regulation and ownership of water rights and so on. There is a lot of overhead and management associated with irrigation, and if you need to change from one place to another, that is not something that can be done from one growing season to the next. It's going to take decades to sort all that out as the demand for water and the demands for irrigation change. And of course, the availability of the water is going to change considerably depending on global warming and so on. This is one of the higher risks for conflict. We already have some climate-related conflicts around the world about access to rivers that cross international borders, where different countries want to be able to extract water from a river to use for irrigation, and then there is insufficient water further downstream. Syria and Iraq and Turkey have often had significant conflicts over access to the waters of the tributaries of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, for example. This is only going to escalate, and we don't necessarily have to only mean in terms of military armed conflict. This can also just be in terms of legal conflict, okay, court cases and things like that, and expensive legal settlements and so on. Now, that gives you a good overview of the kinds of things that we're talking about with regard to like the kinds of human impacts. How about the effects on ecosystems? To be honest, this became a very difficult thing to write, simply because your textbook uses a handful of examples of effects on ecosystems, and if you go online or you start looking at other textbooks, there's an infinite number of effects on ecosystems. Any number of different species that are being strained by global warming, that are being forced into new habitats or out of old habitats, or their prey no longer lives over here, or they don't have access to enough water, or who knows what. So I want to keep this part a little bit simple. I do want you to have read everything that's in the text. The stuff that's in the text about this stuff is definitely fair game for the quiz and so on. But let's just focus on one thing that the first edition of the textbook dwelled on, and that was lizards. Because I thought lizards was a good example of why we need to worry about such a thing. Lizards are cold-blooded. You would think that means they like it when it's warm. But a more accurate way to say it is they like it when it's in a range of temperatures. When it gets too warm, cold-blooded creatures have to rest. They can't actually function very well during the heat of the hottest days and so on. So they go find a shady spot under a rock or something like that, and the lizards rest during the heat of the day. But here's the deal. When they're resting, they're not finding food. And so as the temperature continues to increase, the problem is the lizards spend less and less time out hunting for food, and eventually they are no longer finding enough food to thrive. They are either not breeding, or the young are not not being hatched, and they're not living, and so on. And extinction can ensue. No, my goodness, they literally aren't awake enough of the time to eat enough to live, or at least to thrive, or whatever. And this is not a small problem. The book says that models show that 40% of all lizard species will be extinct by the year 2080. I had never heard that statistic before I saw it in the book, but that sounds fairly horrifying to me. And it isn't like it was just the global mean temperature change that did it. Specifically, it was the local temperature, just how many hours of a day it was crossing a certain threshold, when it was too warm for that lizard to be active anymore. And in particular, I believe in the example in the book, it was actually specifically during one part of the day, one part of the year, I think breeding season or something. I don't quite remember. It's been a long time since I read that chapter. But the idea is solid. Wow, we could fairly easily drive a whole class of critters here to extinction just through a little bit of global warming. Now, a valid point is you could say, who cares about lizards? I mean, I hope everybody cares about lizards, but maybe nobody cares about lizards. But you know what? Their predators do. The creatures that eat lizards and depend on them for the protein in their diet, they do not want lizards to go extinct. And the things that the lizards eat need the lizards too, to keep their populations under control and to have a viable, the healthiest ones are the ones that breed and so on. I mean, that's all just sort of a kind of crude way of saying that lizards are part of the food web. And we can't just take them out and think that everything's going to be okay. And so it's not really just about the lizards. If the lizards aren't thriving, there's going to be other things in that environment that aren't thriving too. The same stresses about heat and so on will also be applying to the snakes and the salamanders and the small birds and the kangaroo rats or whatever else lives in the same environment as those lizards. This is kind of a problem that environmental science people often encounter. Lizards are a part of the ecology of a region, and you may or may not care about lizards. But I bet you care about pandas. Pandas are darn cute. Now, pandas don't eat lizards and lizards don't eat pandas, but everybody loves pandas. And we want to conserve pandas, but you know what? It doesn't really have much to do with the pandas. The pandas are a part of the ecosystem, but they're just part of it. And if the pandas aren't thriving due to global warming or climate change or population encroaching on their habitat or whatever, the problem is the other stuff in the environment that people don't care as much about are also probably not thriving. I mean, like for example, there may be critical bacteria in the soil who break down certain materials and make it into the nutrients that feed the bamboo, that feed the pandas. Nobody really cares. It's really hard to get people to send money to your telethon when you're save the soil bacteria. No, save the panda, you'll get people to send money. Okay, this is a common problem in environmental science. People get excited about pandas and polar bears and other big, fuzzy, cute, well, I'm not sure polar bears are all that cute, but you know what I'm saying, creatures. But that's not necessarily the main reason why we do the kinds of environmental work we do. Same with, like, for example, tearing out, this isn't directly related to global warming, but it kind of gives you a sense of the nature of the problem here. Out in the West right now, like Oregon right now, is tearing out a lot of old dams that were controlling flooding and or providing electrical power along various rivers that flow into the Pacific Ocean, and that, of course, was a disaster for salmon. So now there's a lot of treaties between different states and different federal agencies and so on to take out some of these dams. Therefore, there's better habitat for salmon. It isn't really about the salmon. Everybody's going to be happy if their salmon are doing well too, but this is about saving the entire ecosystem. You can get the public to care about salmon. It's hard to get them to care about some pollywog or some tadpole or some algae or something that lives in those ponds and those rivers, even if that's like fundamental to how the food chain works. You can get people to pass laws and sign treaties to take out hydroelectric dams over salmon, but the story isn't really about the salmon. The salmon are a marker for the fact that the whole ecosystem is sick. And in the same way, when we have species that we're worried about because of global warming, usually it's great horned owls or penguins or something like that, but there are species that the public will care about. It's actually about saving their whole ecosystem. All right, I don't want to go through thousands of possible ways that we could talk about different species that are suffering due to global warming. You know those stories. All right? Instead, let's do a couple quick questions and then we'll be done with this lecture. Question 7. In the United States, the single largest source of weather-related fatalities is A, hurricanes, B, tornadoes, C, heat waves, or D, winter weather. What causes the most fatalities in the United States? All right, make a choice from those 4 options and get a little feedback before you move on to question 8.